Vietnam, Dak To Valley, November 4th, 1967, 22:34. Captain William Albrecht listened to the crackling radio at Firebase Kate and understood. The next 20 minutes would determine whether his battery survived. Observers on Hill 875 had just transmitted. 3 NVA battalions, nearly 1,800 men, were moving through the jungle directly toward his position. 4 105mm howitzers, 86-man garrison, a perimeter only 200 meters in diameter carved from the jungle a week ago. By all canons of Soviet military science that North Vietnamese officers studied, Firebase Kate should fall within the hour. The assault commander, Colonel Le Min Dao, who had spent 3 years training in the USSR, planned a classic encirclement operation. Isolate the base, suppress firing positions with mortars and RPGs, breach the wire obstacles under cover of darkness. His Soviet instructors had taught him precise calculations. How many rounds needed for suppression, how many men for breakthrough, what tempo of advance to maintain. Everything was calibrated according to manuals written from the experience of World War II battles. But Colonel Dao did not know one number. 7. That was how many fire bases sat within range of Kate. 42 tubes, from 105mm to heavy 175mm guns, that within 3 minutes of a request could transform any grid square of jungle into a zone of total annihilation. Soviet doctrine taught concentration of forces. American doctrine taught concentration of fire. This was the mathematics of a new type of warfare, where a single isolated base, became a deadly trap for those who dared attack it. At 22:37, the first flashes of mortar fire illuminated the jungle a kilometer from the perimeter. Albrecht picked up the microphone and spoke the call sign that would unleash a mechanism of artillery retribution unprecedented in the history of war. What followed in the darkness above Dak To Valley demonstrated a revolutionary concept that transformed ground warfare: the fire-base system. This network of mutually supporting artillery positions, coordinated through instantaneous communications and guided by aerial observers, created battlefield geometry that rendered traditional assault tactics obsolete. Firebase Kate's survival that night depended on a mathematical reality Soviet military theorists failed to anticipate: the ability to concentrate overwhelming firepower from dispersed positions faster than any attacking force could maneuver. American firebase doctrine represented fundamental departure from conventional artillery employment. Where traditional artillery served as supporting arms for infantry operations, the firebase inverted this relationship. Artillery became the primary weapon system, with infantry providing local security while guns dominated vast territories through coordinated fire. Each base was simultaneously fortress and weapons platform, positioned yet not to hold ground, but to control space through overlapping fields of fire reaching 15 to 30 kilometers, depending on weapon system. The numbers illustrated the revolution. A single 105mm howitzer battery, 6 guns, could deliver 120 rounds per minute onto target. But Firebase Kate did not fight alone. Within 180 seconds of Albrecht's fire mission request, artillery liaison officers at 7 surrounding bases, Fire Support Base 12, FSB Whiskey, FSB November, FSB Fox, FSB Zulu Zulu, FSB Golf, and the heavy gun position at FSB St. George, received coordinates and commenced firing sequences, 42 tubes speaking in unison. In the first 10 minutes, American gunners delivered over 2,400 high-explosive shells into pre-planned defensive fire zones, designated by alphanumeric codes that every man on Kate had memorized. This was artillery warfare as industrial process, where human skill merged with systematic organization to create effects transcending individual heroism. Fire direction centers plotted trajectories using mechanical computers, factoring wind speed, air density, propellant temperature, and barrel wear to deliver shells within 50 meters of designated coordinates, often closer. Forward observers, both on the ground and circling overhead in light aircraft, adjusted fire through radio calls that took seconds to transmit and minutes to execute. The entire system operated with speed and precision that Soviet doctrine, built around mass artillery barrages fired from surveyed positions at static targets, could not match. Understanding the dominance demonstrated at Firebase. Kate requires examining how these positions came into existence. Construction of a firebase in the Central Highlands was itself an engineering achievement, showcasing American logistical capabilities. When the decision came to establish Kate in late October 1967, the location was solid jungle canopy. Triple canopy rainforest covering terrain that rose and fell in ridges offering no natural clearings. The site was chosen not for tactical convenience, but for geometric necessity. Its elevation and position created optimal firing angles to cover valleys where intelligence indicated NVA infiltration routes. Transformation from jungle to fortress began with aerial bombardment. B-52 strikes and tactical fighter runs using cluster bombs and napalm cleared vegetation from a circular area roughly 250 meters in diameter. Engineer units from the 299th Engineer Battalion arrived via Chinook helicopters, carrying chainsaws, explosives, and heavy equipment that had been disassembled for air transport. Within 72 hours, engineers had leveled the ground, constructed earthen revetments for 4 gun positions, dug communications trenches connecting firing positions to the fire direction center, emplaced ammunition bunkers reinforced with steel culvert sections and sandbags, and cleared fields of fire extending 200 meters beyond the perimeter wire. The artillery pieces themselves arrived underslung beneath CH-47 Chinook helicopters. Each M102 105mm howitzer weighed 3,195 pounds, light enough for helicopter transport, yet capable of firing 33-pound projectiles to a maximum range of 11,500 meters at a rate of 10 rounds per minute sustained fire. The M102 represented American design philosophy. Mobility combined with hitting power. Its lower weight compared to earlier models came from innovative use of aluminum alloy in the carriage, while maintaining structural strength through improved metallurgy. Soviet-supplied D-30 122mm howitzers used by North Vietnamese forces outranged the M102 slightly, but required truck transport and took significantly longer to emplace and prepare for firing. Firebase Kate's perimeter defenses followed standardized doctrine refined through bitter experience. 3 rows of concertina wire surrounded the position, with the outer row 50 meters from the earthen berm. Claymore mines, each containing 700 steel balls behind 1.5 pounds of C4 explosive, were emplaced every 10 meters along avenues of approach. Command detonated from fighting positions. Illumination flares on tripods provided instant artificial daylight over kill zones. The communications bunker, dug 3 meters below ground and covered with multiple layers of logs, sandbags, and steel planking, housed radio equipment connecting Kate to division artillery headquarters, forward observer teams, tactical air control, and the network of surrounding fire bases. At 22:37, as Colonel Dow's mortar teams commenced their preparatory bombardment, Captain Albrecht initiated the sequence that would determine the night's outcome. His radio call to the Fire Direction Center was terse and practiced. Fire mission. Grid coordinates X-ray Sierra 847362. 3 battalions NVA assembly area. Request Victor Tango. Victor Tango was code for time on target. A fire mission where multiple batteries time their firing so that shells from dispersed positions arrive simultaneously, giving the enemy no warning before the bombardment begins and no time to scatter. The Fire Direction Center at Artillery Group Headquarters received Albrecht's request at 22:38. Within 20 seconds, the fire direction officer determined that 7 fire bases could range the target coordinates. Radio operators transmitted fire missions to each position simultaneously. At Fire Support Base 12, 8 kilometers northeast of Kate, gun crews received coordinates at 22:38:45. At FSB St. George, 14 kilometers west, the fire mission arrived at 22:38:50. At each position, Fire Direction Center personnel, 3-man teams trained to perform ballistic calculations with mechanical precision, plotted firing solutions. The M18 plotting board, a mechanical computer using slide rules and trajectory charts, allowed gunners to calculate azimuth, elevation, and propellant charge in under 60 seconds per gun. The process was systematic. Plot target location on gridded map, determine distance and bearing from gun position to target. Consult firing tables for elevation angle based on range and desired trajectory. Select propellant charge. Calculate deflection for wind and other atmospheric factors. Transmit firing data to gun crews. At 22:40:30, the fire direction officer at Artillery Group Headquarters transmitted the execute command. All batteries commence firing at 22:42. The time on target calculation required coordination that would have been impossible without radio communications. Each gun position sat at a different range from the target, meaning shells would have different flight times. The M102 firing at maximum charge sent projectiles on trajectories lasting approximately 45 seconds flight time to a target 10,000 meters distant. Heavy 175mm guns at FSB St. George, firing at near maximum range, had shell flight times exceeding 60 seconds. Fire direction specialists calculated the time interval needed for each gun to fire so that all rounds arrived within a 5-second window, creating simultaneous impacts across the target area. At 22:42:03, the first 105mm high-explosive shell detonated in the assembly area, where Colonel Dow's battalions prepared for their assault. 3 seconds later, 41 more shells arrived. Each M1 high-explosive shell contained 4.8 pounds of Composition B explosive and fragmented into thousands of steel splinters effective against personnel within a 50-meter radius. The simultaneous detonation of 42 shells across an area 400 meters long and 200 meters wide created an effect that soldiers described as walking through a wall of fire and steel. Colonel Dow's carefully assembled formations, positioned in the jungle believing they remained undetected, disintegrated under the bombardment. Companies that moments before had been organized for assault became scattered groups of survivors seeking cover. Battalion command posts, identifiable by their concentration of radio operators and officers, received special attention as forward observers called adjustments. Add 100, right 50, fire for effect. The fire for effect command unleashed the full capacity of American artillery. Batteries firing at maximum sustainable rate, 10 rounds per gun per minute, walking explosions through the target area in systematic patterns that left no space untouched. The artillery response at Firebase. Kate exemplified American fire support doctrine that had been refined throughout the war. This doctrine rested on 3 foundational principles: immediate availability, overwhelming volume, and surgical precision. Immediate availability meant that artillery support was not something requested through time-consuming command channels, but was pre-coordinated and ready to execute on seconds' notice. Fire bases maintained ammunition stockpiles, allowing sustained firing for hours without resupply. Gun crews remained at reduced manning levels, but could achieve full firing status within minutes of alert. Overwhelming volume meant that American forces did not respond proportionally to enemy action, but sought to deliver firepower massively exceeding what the tactical situation strictly required. Soviet artillery doctrine calculated ammunition expenditure based on military efficiency. How many rounds were mathematically necessary to achieve desired effects against specific target types? American doctrine calculated expenditure based on availability. If a fire base possessed 10,000 rounds of 105mm ammunition and a fire mission justified using 2,000 rounds to ensure target destruction, those 2,000 rounds would be fired. The logistics system existed to maintain ammunition stockpiles, and artillery served to expend ammunition against targets. This approach horrified Soviet advisors schooled in resource conservation, but proved devastatingly effective. Surgical precision referred not to individual shell accuracy, but to the system's ability to deliver massed fires exactly where needed without hitting friendly forces. Danger-close artillery missions, fires delivered within 600 meters of friendly positions, were routine in Vietnam. Forward observers marked friendly positions with colored smoke grenades, communicated precise coordinates, and walked artillery fires to within 200 meters of their own locations. The trust this required was absolute. Soldiers pinned down by enemy fire called artillery onto their own positions, knowing that the shells would arrive within 50 meters of designated coordinates, and that those 50 meters made the difference between survival and annihilation. The night of November 4th at Firebase, Kate saw all three principles demonstrated simultaneously. Within 5 minutes of the first fire mission, American artillery had delivered over 800 rounds into Colonel Dow's assault formations. Within 15 minutes, the number exceeded 2,000. Fire direction centers coordinated missions from multiple bases without conflict, assigning different batteries to different target areas as forward observers identified mortar positions, command posts, and assembly areas through the distinctive signatures visible through starlight scopes and from aerial observation posts. The forward air controller attached to Kate, flying in an O-1 Bird Dog observation aircraft at 2,500 feet, provided additional targeting information. Circling over the battlefield, he observed muzzle flashes from NVA mortars and radioed coordinates to artillery batteries, with corrections measured in tens of meters. His position allowed him to see the overall tactical picture, where enemy formations massed, which routes they used for movement, where reserves positioned themselves. This aerial perspective, impossible for ground commanders to obtain, gave American forces a decisive information advantage that translated directly into targeting data. Colonel Lamin Dow's plan for the assault on Firebase. Kate reflected orthodox Soviet tactical thinking adapted to jungle warfare. Soviet advisors who trained NVA officers at the Combined Arms Academy in Hanoi emphasized principles derived from the Great Patriotic War. Concentration of forces at the decisive point. Suppression of enemy firing positions through preparatory bombardment. Rapid assault to close with the enemy before artillery could respond effectively. Exploitation of breakthrough to capture or destroy artillery positions. These principles had proven effective against Wehrmacht forces defending static positions with limited communications and slow artillery response times. The Soviet advisory mission in North Vietnam, which by 1967 included over 3,000 military specialists, provided not only training but also tactical planning assistance for major operations. Soviet colonels and generals with combat experience from World War II and subsequent conflicts reviewed NVA operational plans, recommended improvements, and sometimes directly supervised preparations for significant attacks. The preparations for the Dak To campaign involved Soviet input at multiple levels. Advisors helped analyze American firebase positions, calculate forces needed for successful assault, and recommend approach routes that would minimize exposure to artillery fire. What Soviet doctrine did not adequately address was the speed and flexibility of American fire support coordination. Soviet artillery practice emphasized centralized control, with fire missions planned in advance and executed according to rigid timetables. Adjusting fire required requests passed up the command chain, verification of coordinates, recalculation of firing data, and dissemination of new orders, a process measured in tens of minutes or hours. This system worked adequately when attacking prepared positions where timing could be synchronized with infantry assault schedules. It failed catastrophically against an enemy whose artillery could respond to calls for fire in under 3 minutes and adjust based on observer corrections in real time. Soviet advisors recognized American artillery superiority in firepower and responsiveness, but believed this advantage could be negated through tactics. Approach routes that used terrain masking, rapid assault tempo that closed with enemy positions before artillery could mass fires, infiltration techniques that positioned assault forces close to target perimeters before launching attacks, and willingness to accept casualties during the final assault phase, when artillery would be ineffective due to danger close ranges. Colonel Dow's plan incorporated all these elements. His battalion spent 4 days moving into assault positions, using valleys and ravines to avoid aerial observation. Orders specified that mortar suppression of American positions would begin simultaneously with the assault, giving defenders no time to request fire support before NVA. Soldiers reached the wire. The plan was professionally crafted, and against a conventional fire base with limited external support, might have succeeded. But Firebase Kate was not an isolated position. It was a node in a network, and that network was about to demonstrate capabilities that Soviet military theory had not anticipated. While 105mm howitzers provided the rapid response backbone of fire-based defense, the heavy artillery systems delivered overwhelming destructive power against targets beyond medium gun range. Fire Support Base. St. George, positioned 14 kilometers west of Kate, housed 4 M107 175mm self-propelled guns, the longest-range tube artillery in the American arsenal. These weapons, mounted on tracked chassis, fired 147-pound projectiles to maximum ranges exceeding 32 kilometers with devastating terminal effects. The M107 represented the apex of American artillery engineering. Its rifled barrel, over 60 calibers long, imparted extreme velocity to projectiles, over 900 meters per second muzzle velocity. This velocity translated to range and penetration. The 147-pound high-explosive shell contained 15 pounds of explosive filling and fragmented into large, heavy splinters that could penetrate light fortifications and were lethal against personnel within a 100-meter radius. More significantly, the sheer kinetic energy of a 147-pound shell arriving from high-angle trajectory could collapse bunkers, destroy vehicles, and create craters 4 meters in diameter and 2 meters deep. Fire Support Base. St. George engaged targets in Colonel Dow's rear areas, the trails his battalions used to approach their assault positions, the clearings where reserves waited, the suspected locations of command posts and logistics staging areas. Heavy guns did not fire for immediate tactical effect, but to create chaos in the enemy rear, cutting off reinforcement and escape routes, destroying command and control, and demonstrating to NVA forces that American firepower could reach them regardless of distance from the front line. The psychological effect of 175mm fire was immense. The shells arrived with a sound described as a freight train passing overhead, followed by detonations that shook the ground hundreds of meters away. NVA soldiers who survived heavy gun bombardment reported the profound demoralization of knowing that no position was safe, that American guns could reach anywhere, that jungle cover and distance provided no protection. Soviet advisors had prepared NVA forces for artillery fire, teaching them to dig deep bunkers, to disperse formations, to move immediately after firing to avoid counter-battery fire. But Soviet doctrine assumed artillery with range measured in tens of kilometers at most, not the 32-kilometer reach of American heavy guns that could strike targets far behind what should have been safe rear areas. When dawn broke over Firebase Kate on November 5th, 1967. The jungle surrounding the base told the story of the night's engagement. American patrols moving beyond the perimeter found evidence of devastation on a scale that shocked even experienced soldiers. The assembly areas where Colonel Dow's battalions had positioned themselves for assault were cratered landscapes of splintered trees, torn earth, and the debris of destroyed equipment. Preliminary counts identified 347 confirmed enemy dead within 800 meters of the base perimeter. Subsequent operations over the following days recovered weapons, equipment, and documents, indicating that Colonel Dow's assault force had suffered casualties approaching 60% before ever reaching Kate's wire obstacles. American casualties told a different story. Firebase. Kate lost 3 men killed during the mortar bombardment that preceded the infantry assault that never came. 8 men suffered wounds requiring medical evacuation. The artillery pieces sustained no damage. Ammunition expenditure totaled 4,200 rounds of 105 millimeters, 890 rounds of 155 millimeter, and 124 rounds of 175 millimeter. Impressive numbers that the logistics system replaced within 36 hours through routine resupply operations. The kill ratio, the crude metric that military statisticians use to measure tactical effectiveness, exceeded 100.1 when comparing American casualties to confirmed enemy dead. And this figure did not account for enemy wounded who withdrew or died beyond American recovery areas. These numbers illustrated the fundamental asymmetry of the firebase system. American forces occupied prepared positions with extensive defensive works, possessed overwhelming firepower advantage, and could call upon resources from across the theater. NVA forces attacking such positions faced a mathematical impossibility. They could not mass sufficient forces to overwhelm defenses without creating targets for American artillery. Yet without massing forces, they lacked the combat power to breach defensive perimeters. The most compelling evidence of American artillery dominance came from North Vietnamese sources after the war. General Vo Nguyen Giap, architect of victories against French and later American forces, wrote in his memoirs about the challenges of operating against American firepower. He acknowledged that tactical engagements against American units typically resulted in heavy casualties for North Vietnamese forces, and that artillery in particular inflicted devastating losses. Giap's strategic approach evolved to avoid situations where American firepower advantages applied, focusing instead on protracted war strategy that accepted tactical defeats in pursuit of strategic exhaustion of American political will. Senior Colonel Hoang Minh Thao, who commanded NVA forces in numerous engagements against American fire bases, provided detailed testimony after the war about the psychological and material effects of American artillery. He reported that units assigned to attack fortified American positions expected casualty rates exceeding 50%, and that successful assaults required favorable conditions: surprise, overwhelming numerical superiority, and rapid execution before American fire support could be fully coordinated. Even under optimal conditions, attacking American fire bases resulted in losses that NVA forces could ill afford. Soviet military analysts reviewing the Vietnam War reached sobering conclusions about the effectiveness of American fire support systems. A classified Soviet General Staff study from 1975 acknowledged that American artillery doctrine and technology had created capabilities that existing Soviet counter-battery and maneuver tactics could not effectively neutralize. The study recommended significant reforms to Soviet artillery organization and fire control procedures, recognizing that future conflicts against Western forces would require responding to fire support coordination operating at speeds Soviet systems could not match. The artillery supremacy demonstrated at Firebase Kate and countless similar engagements throughout the Vietnam War represented more than tactical proficiency. It showcased a fundamental revolution in ground warfare, where technology, logistics, and systematic doctrine combined to create battlefield effects that conventional military thinking could not counter. The fire-based system turned artillery from supporting arm into dominant weapon, created defensive positions that could not be reduced through traditional assault tactics, and demonstrated that modern communications and coordination could concentrate dispersed firepower faster than any enemy could mass attacking forces. The system's effectiveness rested on three foundations that Soviet doctrine and North Vietnamese capabilities could not replicate. First was the communications architecture linking fire bases, forward observers, aerial controllers, and fire direction centers into a responsive network operating in real time. Second was the logistics system delivering ammunition in quantities that made overwhelming fire responses routine rather than exceptional. Third was the training and professionalism of American artillerymen who operated complex systems under extreme pressure with precision that turned mechanical calculations into lethal effects. For the men who served in fire bases like Kate, the system's sophistication mattered less than its reliability. When Captain Albrecht picked up that microphone on November 4th, 1967, he knew with absolute certainty that his call would be answered, that American artillery would respond, that the mathematics of firepower would tip the balance in his favor. That certainty, that faith in the system and the men who operated it, defined the fire-based doctrine's greatest achievement. It transformed isolated positions in hostile territory into nodes of American military power that could not be overcome through courage or tactical skill alone.